तो रज़ा, आज जो हमारा जहाँ से हम बेसिकली अब लेके चलना चाहते हैं वो ये है कि ऑफ कोर्स हमने एक बेसिक आइडिया ऑफ मेंटोलॉजी इंट्रोड्यूस कर चुके हैं हम लोगों के साथ, बट आई थिंक इन ऑर्डर फॉर मोस्ट पीपल टू अंडरस्टैंड हाउ इट फिट्स इनटू देयर लाइव्स, वी वांट टू स्टार्ट sort of with a very basic question that I guess everybody asks in their life, which is some point in their life, which is, what is the purpose of my life? You know, why am I living my life? And I think I want to start from there.
देखो ना, in conversation, if you were to ask a question, so I suppose one would say that the purpose of your life is to be healthy and grow up and have a career and have a family. And
generally, it's be happy.
Generally, be happy. Do normal items हैं, useful items in relation to man. That would be the answer. But I would like to deal with the question from a different angle, and that is that I would like to first try and understand, where does a sense of purpose come from? If you are going to have purpose in life, then you must have a sense of purpose. Otherwise, you would be looking at a man as a clean slate, and the question would be, what do you want to write on it? Which is not true. So, animals have needs. So, you don't have to go to human beings to discover inner needs of an individual animal. In the case of man, those needs become more complex and more elaborated compared to animals. You have not only biological needs, simple biological needs, but in addition, you have a much more developed emotional function in human beings compared to animals, and also a much more mental, a much more developed mental process. So the emotional and the mental processes produce your needs, apart from your natural needs, such as going to the loo.
Understood.
Or having a glass of water, apart from these ordinary things, simple things, which we share with animals.
बिल्कुल सही.
I think you are interested in focusing on those things which are
we don't share
special and specific to human beings.
Absolutely.
In addition to the animal
Absolutely.
needs. That then at once makes you focus your attention on the emotional makeup of the person and the mental makeup of the person, how he thinks and how he feels. So it's a question of how do these feelings and thinking, ideas, they come into being, how do they become? When a child is born, the child has animal needs, and but very quickly as the child grows, he develops an emotional, it grows, unfolds, develops the emotional makeup of that child.
Right.
And keeps growing till he becomes young, an adult. So, partly there are genetic programs with which the child is born.
बिल्कुल सही.
It becomes manifest as it grows, as the child grows. But it comes with the genes. This which is commonly known as inheritance. कि ये बाप पर गया है, ये माँ पर गया है, ये नानकों पर गया है, so on so forth. That refers to the genetic formation, both in the matter of feelings or desires and thinking, which means how intellect works. But then the genetic process is an unconscious process.
बिल्कुल सही.
One does not make it consciously. It's made at the time of conception and the time of gestation. वो जेनेटिक परम्यूटेशन कॉम्बिनेशन होते हैं, फीलिंग उसमें. फिर उसका एनवायरनमेंट होता है, एजुकेटेड है या नहीं एजुकेटेड है, और अगर एजुकेशन है तो व्हाट काइंड ऑफ एजुकेशन इज इट, है ना. देयर आर मेनी वैराइटीज ऑफ एजुकेशन. और फिर ये फाइनली ये कि व्हाट एनवायरनमेंट ही हैज, what are the circumstances in which he is growing up, and what are his responses. Now, as you grow, your genetic structure, which you are born with, emotional and intellectual, they keep getting modified by your environment. So, by the time the child becomes an adult, you can identify what his purposes. Their purposes become more defined, more crystallized, emotional as well as intellectual. Now at this stage, I would like to point out that emotional needs and formations are more or less a universal phenomenon, the growth of the emotional process. It varies from individual to individual, but the happening is a universal phenomenon. The intellectual process is not such a universal phenomenon. Shall we say that it is relatively optional? It depends upon whether the intellect has been growing and developing or not. Intellect grows only when in the course of application. When you use it, only then it grows. And then as you determine the direction of its usage, that determines how your intellect grows. So there is a much greater variation in the intellectual processes. In some cases it's totally undeveloped, in some cases highly developed, and in between. So do keep this distinction in mind. What I have said so far is about the existing state, and it is out of an interaction of the two that the individual's specific emotional purposes they take shape. They mature. What is your emotional agenda? What are your strong likes and strong dislikes? So your agenda is steered as it forms in between these limits of liking and disliking. So that's really a study in partly in genetics and partly in environmental, a study of the environment. Environment here typically means social environment. And social environment includes the family environment and the surrounding environment, and then the larger environment, the context. The environment not only determines the direction that an individual's formation takes, steers it, as it were. The environment steers the individual's formation. But it also sets limits, what is possible and what is impossible. So in making your purposes, you avoid what is impossible,
because
generally speaking. And
very interesting.
Within the realm of possibilities, you make your choices. And the same is true of the intellect. except that intellect is much more optional than the emotional process. The emotion process is much more universal.
ठीक है, हम समझ गए.
The intellectual is relatively optional. If there is an intellectual process which is developed in an individual, then there is an interaction between the emotional process and
absolutely.
the intellectual.
बिल्कुल. Understood.
If
it has
and the extent to which the intellectual
process
is developed, to that extent there will be an interaction between the two.
Makes complete sense.
And that interaction is really of a kind of a merger. The emotion processes will have a tendency to steer the intellectual development. And the intellectual processes will have a tendency to influence the emotional processes.
Very well said.
So that is what I mean by interaction. Then it is a richer life. Obviously it becomes richer. And if the intellect is not developed and only the emotional processes is developed, then it will be a poorer life in terms of purposes. Now then again there is a third factor, another factor, and that is not only environment, but the experience with the environment.
Experience within the environment.
With the environment. The experience of the individual in his environment.
How is that different from the environment?
Environment itself. Well, that is again the result of an interaction between the individual and his environment. The emotions, or the emotional formation of a person is not 100% fulfilled. It's not a straight line. Okay. That if you have an emotional process and you assume that the emotional processes will be satisfied in the environment, okay, they will find satisfaction in the environment. You can't assume that.
Okay.
There is an action and reaction between the environment and that.
So the experience with the environment essentially is limited to...
Comes in.
To the extent to which he can interact with the environment,
yes,
is what will determine the experience.
Quite
understood.
Right.
Understood.
So there are degrees of satisfaction and dissatisfaction. Success and failure. Emotional success and emotional failure.
Emotional success and emotional failure with respect to the environment.
Yes. And that keeps varying from time to time and from individual to individual. So you have to look at
very interesting. Very
an
interesting.
individual in detail.
Wow.
Success and failure produce their own reaction upon the existing emotional formation.
Wow. Amazing.
Huh?
I could never imagine you would put it together like it's so easy, but it's something that we never thought of.
But
like
those
that.
reactions then again modify the emotional formation.
That's the dynamic that is going on and on and on. Wow.
Now the same is true of the intellectual process to the extent to which it has come into existence in the case of a particular individual. As I have already said, it varies greatly, the intellectual. The emotional formation is much more common, but not so the intellectual. Now again, with respect to the intellectual formation, there is a basic intellectual form which even animals have, intelligence, animal intelligence. So in human beings also there is a basic intelligence. So I'm not using the term intellect for that. I'm reserving the term intellect for conscious and deliberate use of intelligence.
बिल्कुल सही. Intellect is the conscious and deliberate use of intelligence.
Which means you think about what you are
Thinking and feeling.
thinking. You think what you are thinking about. And that keeps interacting not only with the environment, but also with the emotional processes. So you see, it's a bit of a pudding, isn't it?
I don't think it's a pudding, Raza, because it's what the way you put it. It's very logical, and it's. I mean, it's not a jumble.
No, it's not a jumble.
Matlab, I always associate.
It's complex.
It's very complex. I mean, it's complex, but you seem to have deciphered that complexity, or at least been able to work with it, as opposed to. I mean, if it were a pudding, it will be just gobbled
by
up.
Looking at their components, by looking at their parts.
No, I have
by looking
really,
at their sequence.
I think the way I followed you, it is really immediately got me on that track of thinking from that perspective. I mean, it was all a matter of just, and to understand this dynamic is it's unbelievable
But
how
if
you
you're
put
not
it together.
thinking, then you have a personality. You just have a personality. Whatever it is, the way it is automatically formed, since childhood to adulthood, in your particular environment. You're unintelligently reactive.